welcome to today's video tutorial where I'm going to show you how to sew this cute little vest called Werner. Werner is an oversized loose fitted vest which comes in 3 different lengths. The longest length ends below your butt, the mid length ends at the mid of your butt, and the cropped one is a bit longer than your waist. As I mentioned before, it is a loose oversized fitted vest. But it's not too oversized in my mind. I've sewn all of my samples in exactly my size. I usually have to grade between 2 sizes because my bust is size B and my hips are size D. So I jump from B to size D, from bust to hip, and I would always recommend to do so if you are falling into different size brackets. As I mentioned before, the fit is oversized and you will find the finished measurements in the written instructions. If you're insecure about the fit, you can double check the finished measurements against a ready-to-wear vest to see how oversized the final fit will be. And if you prefer to wear fitted or tight tops underneath, you can size down 1 size 2. I've designed this vest to fit over a large jumper. Werner is fully lined and it looks neat from the in and outside. And also you will have seam pockets, snap fasteners, and all the edges are being finished with bias tape. If you want, you can add some elastic into the back hemline so you can adjust the width of your hem. I would recommend to do so for the cropped length because it has the most positive ease around your waistline, while the finished hemlines are not as wide for the mid and longest length. But this is something you can decide at the very end when your vest is finished if you want to add elastic or not. Regarding the difficulty, I would say it's a quite simple make, except there are 2 points that you need to consider. The first one is your fabric choice for the main and lining fabric. Those 2 fabrics need to have the same properties regarding stretch. So if your outer fabric is stretchy, you will have to pick a stretchy lining fabric too. And if your outer fabric is not stretchy, you will have to pick a non-stretchy lining fabric. But I will come back to that point when I talk about the materials. The second point is the bias tape, which is not exactly hard to sew, but you will, fun is annoying, but you will have to do it with a lot of patience because it takes quite a while, and also you will have to sew really straight and neat to get a nice finish. But if you're doing it with patience, I'm sure that you can do it even as a beginner. To make this vest, you will not need an overlocker. You can fully sew it with your regular sewing machine. Regarding the materials, you will need an outer fabric and a lining fabric. As I mentioned before, those 2 fabrics need to have the same stretch properties. So if your outer fabric is stretchy, I would recommend a stretchy lining fabric, a knit fabric, a cotton knit fabric. And if your outer fabric is not stretchy, I would recommend a non-stretchy woven fabrics such as classic lining fabrics, but also a lightweight cotton woven fabric would do the job. For the outer fabrics, my recommendations are felted wool fabrics, plush fabrics, quilted fabrics, and any coat fabric is perfectly suitable. Apart from the fabric, you will need bias tape. As I mentioned before, I'm using the one which is 2 centimeters wide. Basically, it's 4 centimeters pre-folded to 2 centimeters. If your fabric is really thick, you can use a wider bias tape as well. Then you will need snap fasteners, 3 to 5 pieces, depending on the length. For the cropped vest, you will need 3 pieces. For the medium length, you will need 4, and for the longest length, you will need 5 snap fasteners. I'm using the ones with a diameter of 12 millimeters. Then you will need some interfacing to reinforce your snap fasteners. I'm using H250 to do so. Last but not least, optional, if you want to add elastic to your back hem, you will need cord, elastic cord, and also 2 toggle cord locks with 2 holes. Yes.
Here is an overview of all the pattern pieces that you will need. From your main fabric you will need the front piece twice, one mirrored pair and the back piece cut on the fold. You will need the same pieces from your lining fabric as well as 4 times the pocket. So that means 2 mirrored pairs of your pocket. The pocket is optional, so you can leave it out if you want. As always, I'm transferring all the markings to my fabric with a little notch. The notch shouldn't be longer as half a centimeter, but if you want, you can also use tailor's chalk. Then transfer the position of your snap fasteners to all of the 4 front pieces to the right fabric side. I always push a needle through the center of my marking to mark it at the opposite side. And then I remove the pattern and repeat this step at the other side by pushing the needle through the marking that I just made. Next, I'm going to reinforce the position of the snap fasteners with interfacing. I'm using 8 250 here, and I've cut little circles with a diameter of 3 centimeters approx, and I will press them to the wrong fabric side of my front pieces, with the sticky side of the interfacing laying together with the wrong fabric side. And I always put parchment paper on my ironing board and also on top to protect it, and I am reinforcing both the lining and also the main fabric pieces. Next, we're going to sew the side and shoulder seams on your main vest. And this is the version with pockets. You will find a marking at all pocket pieces, and the marking should always be facing down. And then just pin the pocket pieces to your side seams of your main fabrics right between those 2 markings at the side seam, and the marking on the pocket is always facing down. And also make sure to pin the pocket to your main fabric pieces with right fabric sides facing. This is what it should look like, and if you want, you can now check if they're all on the same height and then sew them together with a regular straight stitch. And here it is important not to sew with 1 but with less than 1 centimeter seam allowance. I always sew with 5 to 7 millimeters of seam allowance. This is what it should look like. And now open it up flat and press the seam allowances towards the pocket. If you're using a heavyweight fabric like a quilted fabric, it might be helpful to also top stitch the seam allowances down on your pocket with a little seam allowance. Now take your front pieces and place them right sides facing to your back piece. The pockets are all folded outwards. And then pin those pieces together along the shoulders and along the side seams. Along the sides, you will pin from armpit 1 centimeter into your pocket, along your pocket, and then the little piece beneath the pocket. we're going to stitch with a 1 centimeter seam allowance and a regular straight stitch. If a regular straight stitch doesn't work on your material, you can also use a small zigzag stitch instead. And at the sides, you will also sew with a 1 centimeter seam allowance. So once you reach your pocket seam, you will notice that your seam is located to the left of the previous seam. Stitch until you're 1 centimeter in the pocket and then leave your needle in the fabric, lift your presser foot and rotate your fabric to get nice and sharp corners. And I'm doing the same thing at the bottom. Leave the needle in the fabric, lift your presser foot, rotate your fabric and then continue sewing. This is what it should look like. You are having nice and sharp corners at the pocket and the side seam is further inside than the seam with which you've sewn on the pockets. If you want, you can now secure the pocket bags within the seam allowance by stitching it to your outer fabric by hand. This makes sense if your pockets are heavy and you're sewing the medium length, because you will notice if you wear it now that the pockets are hanging down, and it's the case with my pocket bags. So just secure them with a few stitches within the seam allowances and make sure just to catch a little bit of your main fabric so that the stitching is not visible from the outside. It perfectly works with plush or thicker coat fabrics. If you want to sew your outer vest without the pockets, this is how it should be done. Just place the front pieces right sides facing to your back piece and pin and stitch along the shoulders and side seam with a regular straight stitch and a 1 centimeter seam allowance. If a regular straight stitch doesn't work, you can also use a small zigzag stitch instead. And now take your lining pieces and place the front pieces right sides facing on the back piece and pin them together along the shoulders and also the side seams. At the bottom of the side seams you will have to leave a little gap of 1 centimeter, which is 1.5 centimeter away from your hemline. This gap will later allow you to insert the elastic cord to adjust the back hem if you want. So first I will just pin along the side. And as you can see here, I've added pins as markings to mark the position of the gap. The red pin is 1.5 centimeter away from the hemline and the distance between those two pins is 1 centimeter. Now I'm going to stitch with a regular straight stitch and a 1 centimeter seam allowance. If a regular straight stitch doesn't work on your fabric, you can also use a small zigzag stitch instead. And I will sew right until the first pin. Then I will back stitch and continue sewing at the other pin. Apart from the side seams, I will stitch across the shoulders with a 1 centimeter seam allowance and a regular straight stitch as well. This is what it should look like, and here you can see the little gap at both side seams at the bottom. The gap is 1.5 centimeters from the hemline away, and the gap is 1 centimeter wide. Lay both wasts in front of you. The main wast is with the right fabric side facing out, while the lining wast is with wrong fabric side facing out. And now put the lining wast into your main wast so that the wrong fabric sides of both wasts are laying together, and you can now only see the nice right fabric sides. And now pin both wasts together all the way around at both front edges, the back neckline, the hemline, and also the armholes. In case one of your fabrics is more stretchy or you feel like one of the wasts is a bit larger than the other one, I would recommend to sew with the larger wast laying at the bottom, because the feet will always work better at the bottom, and this way under normal circumstances you can equalize it a bit. This is what it should look like now, and it will be correct if you don't see any visible seam from the in or outside, only the nice right fabric sides. And now it's time to stitch all the way around along all the edges to keep everything in place. And I'm stitching with a regular straight stitch. I'm using a quite long stitch here between 4 and 5, and I'm stitching close to the edge with a distance of maximum half a centimeter. This is what it should look like. All edges are being stitched together. Next, we're going to attach the bias tape. It gives the vest a very clean and professional finish. I always start at one of the side seams and pin the bias tape to it so that the end protrudes by 1 to 1.5 centimeters, and then I will fold the end on the tape so that there is a fold which lays flush with your side seam, and I will pin it in place. The bias tape is being pinned to the right fabric side of your outer vest. If you are experienced, you can make this step without pinning it first. So if you are experienced, you can just sew on the tape without pinning. But if you're a beginner, I would recommend to pin to make sure that it turns out nice and neat. At the front, you will find a total amount of 4 corners at the front and bottom. And here you will have to pin the bias tape very loosely. I always push it together a little bit to make sure it is pinned here very loosely, and I will also clip into the bias tape every 1 centimeter, and I will stop 1 to 2 millimeters before the first fold at all of the 4 corners to make sure that the bias tape is being stitched here very loosely to avoid the fabric from bulging later. This is how I will proceed at all of the 4 corners, and at the back neckline the opposite is the case because the curve at the back neckline is curved inwards. So here I will try to pin, and so with a tiny bit of tension, basically I will pull the bias tape a tiny bit to make sure the bias tape will lay nice and flat at the back neckline. Once you reach your side seam again, pin the tape so that it overlaps your side seam by 1 to 1.5 centimeter again. It is now laying on top of the beginning, and you can now cut it to size. This is what it should look like. Beneath there is your beginning, which is folded inwards, and on top of it is the end of your tape, and this is how we're going to sew it on now. This is what your vest should look like now, and here you can see the corners once again. And now I will sew on the tape with a regular straight stitch and a large M stitch. I'm sewing with a stitching length of approximately 4, and then just sew it on right on the fold. This is what it will look like now. The bias tape is sewn on all the way around to the edge, right on the first fold. And here you can see the transition again. If you now fold it inwards, it will look nice and neat with no open edges being visible. Now wrap your bias tape around the edge to the lining vest and pin it in place here. I would recommend to pin on the outside right at the height where you will sew later, so you can always check on the inside if you have caught the tape or not. Always make sure that the tape covers the seam with which you've sewn on the tape, and if your seam allowance is too thick and you're not able to wrap it around, you can always crop it back and trim off some of the seam allowance. And now just pin the bias tape all the way around. It requires a bit of patience, but the better you will pin it, the nicer and neater will be your finished look. Here you can see how it will look at the side seams where the end and start will meet. If you fold over both layers one by one, you will see that you will get a nice and clean transition, and this is what the west will look like now. And now it's time to stitch. I'm using a regular straight stitch, and I'm stitching right on the tape, approximately 1 to 2 millimeters from the edge. Take your time here to make sure you're stitching a straight line, and you can check every now and then if you've caught the tape on the inside. I always stitch with the right fabric side of my main west facing up, because this will be the side that will be visible from the outside, so it's important that this side looks good. Now I'm going to finish the armholes in the exact same way. I will start at the side seam again, and I will fold the beginning of my bias tape over, and then I will just pin it to the armhole. And here again, the armhole is curved inwards, so I will pin on the tape with a tiny bit of tension to make sure that the bias tape lays nice and flat in the curve and won't bulge. This is what the edges will look like, and last but not least, it's time to press. The bias tape nice and flat with steam. It will remove the wrinkles and it will also turn out nice and flat. Now it's time to attach the snap fasteners. I always pin some pins right between the markings to make sure that both fabric layers are laying flush. You cannot see the markings of my snap fasteners because of the structure of this fabric, but in real life I was able to see it. And then I would recommend to check if the markings are at the same height. You can always double check and see how far the snap fasteners should be apart, and they are always 2 centimeters from the front edge. And if the positions are right, use any tool to punch holes right into the markings. Now it's time to attach the snap fasteners. I always use the Prüm Vario pliers to do so, and the cap and the socket will be on the right side. The cap is the flat piece and the socket is the one with the little hole. And at the opposite side I will attach the stud and the post piece. The method of how to attach it will be different depending on the tool you're using, but normally there will be instructions coming along with your snap fasteners. If you want, you can now top stitch the front pocket opening so it will lay nice and flat. Therefore, just pin along your front pocket opening. The pocket piece will be laying around 3 millimeters further inside, as you can see here. And I will start to pin right at the pocket opening. And now I'm going to stitch with a regular straight stitch. and around half a centimeter of seam allowance. I will start right at the beginning of the pocket opening, and here I will leave my needle in the fabric, lift my presser foot and rotate the fabric to get nice and sharp corners. Make sure only to stitch the front piece and your front pocket bag together and not to accidentally catch the back pocket piece or to sew the pocket close. And this is what it will look like, and this only works at the front piece. Last but not least, you can add elastic to your back hem by stitching a straight line right here above the gap that you left in the side seam. I am running a regular straight stitch approximately 3 centimeters from the edge. This is what it should look like. I've stitched from side seam to side seam. And now take your elastic cord. It should be a bit longer than your back hem and you should lay it double. Then take your toggle cord lock and thread the end through both of the holes, and the other end will be inserted into the channel with the help of a safety pin. Thread it through both holes of the other toggle cord lock and then thread the end through the tunnel again, back to the other side. Now the ends need to be connected, and therefore I will place them right next to each other, and I will wrap a little piece of fabric, I'm using bias tape here, around it, and then I will sew with a large zigzag stitch to connect it. It's a bit fumbly because you cannot really pin it, but with the help of the zigzag stitch it will work. And then trim off the excess fabric, and now you can adjust your back hem at any time.